This is Adam from the AML shop, and today we'll be talking about suspicious transaction reporting. Suspicious transaction reports, or STRs, are FINTRAC's primary source of financial intelligence, so it's no surprise that they really focus on them when they conduct their examinations. When I talk to a lot of clients, though, I find that people tend to be confused as to how to properly complete these reports. So today we'll walk through the reporting form together, and I'll show you how to avoid common reporting errors and subsequent deficiencies. So let's get started. So this is the STR form on the web reporting platform that FINTRAC provides to allow reporting entities to submit their regulatory reports electronically. As you can see, we're in the practice environment, which is a good way for compliance staff to practice completing these forms without having to actually submit a report to FINTRAC. If you look on the right side of the screen, you'll notice that there are 7 parts shown for the STR. Part A is the location where the suspicious activity occurred. Part B1 is how the transaction was initiated. Part B2 is how the transaction was dispositioned, in other words, how it was concluded. Part C, this is where we document any accounts that were affected by the disposition. Part D is used to document information about the conductor, in other words, the individual who performed the suspicious transactions. Part G is where we document the nature of our suspicion. And lastly, Part H is where we record the details of any other actions that we took as a result of the suspicious transactions. Now you probably noticed that Part E and F are missing. In Part B2, we're required to declare if the transaction was conducted on behalf of another individual or on behalf of an entity. If we indicate that the transaction was conducted on behalf of an entity, we need to complete Part E. If we indicate that the transaction was conducted on behalf of an individual, we need to complete Part F. I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about when we dive into Part B2 in more detail. Okay, so here we are in Part A of the STR form, and you can see that this section is titled Location, although we'll provide FINTRAC with some other information here as well. The first thing that we need to indicate is whether the transaction was attempted or completed. We can't report attempted and completed transactions in the same report, so if you need to report activity that relates to both attempted and completed activity, you'll need to report the attempted and completed transactions in separate submissions. In the next section, we describe where the transaction or attempted transaction took place. If it was conducted at an ATM, do not put the address of the machine. Instead, you're going to want to document the address of the branch where the account was held, or in the case of a crypto ATM, the address of head office. Unless the crypto ATM is located at a branch or an agent, in which case you should list that address. If your report is related to transactions that were conducted at multiple locations, you'll need to find a separate report for each location. So basically, we can only report multiple suspicious instances in a single report if all of the activity was either attempted or completed, and all of the activity occurred at a single location. So the first field here is the reporting entity location number. And this is a number that is automatically generated to each one of your locations when you register for electronic reporting with FINTRAC. And in the next field, we're going to simply enter the complete physical address of the branch or the agent or the location where it took place. Now we need to tell FINTRAC who they can contact if they need more information about the report. And this is usually the person who reviewed the activity and made the determination that there was reasonable ground to suspect and that a report needs to be filed. So some reporting entities assign internal reference numbers to the regulatory reports, in addition to the report number that FINTRAC provides. And if this is part of your process, you need to document the internal reference here. Otherwise, you can just leave this blank, and then we just need to document the name and contact info for our FINTRAC contact person. No reason why any of these fields should be blank, except for possibly the person's other initial or their extension if those fields are applicable. Lastly, we need to choose the type of activity that's most reflective of our business from this drop-down menu here, which includes all of the entity types that FINTRAC regulates. So that's how to properly complete Part A, and now we can move on to Part B1. So in Part B1, we need to provide FINTRAC with information about how the transaction was initiated. You'll notice that like all FINTRAC reports, there are three types of fields. Mandatory fields, which mean that the field needs to be completed. Mandatory if applicable, which means that the field only needs to be completed if it's relevant to the type of transaction that you're reporting. For example, if a transaction wasn't initiated by a deposit into an account, there's no need to complete the night deposit field. And lastly, we have fields that are unlabeled, which means that we need to take reasonable measures to obtain that information. Basically, this means that if the information is contained in your records, you need to include it in the report. With all that being said, in some instances, particularly with reports related to attempted transactions, you might not have certain information relating to mandatory fields. You should still submit the report in these cases though, and just provide as much information as you can. As a best practice though, it's a good idea to keep a record of why you weren't able to obtain the mandatory information. Alright, well in the first section here, we need to provide the date and time of the transaction, as well as whether the transaction was conducted through a night deposit. Well, that's all pretty straightforward, but clients often ask me about this fourth field, the date of posting. This field only needs to be completed if the funds were deposited into an account on a different date than the transaction date that's entered into the first field. It's not a very common scenario, but if it's relevant to your suspicious transaction, then just enter the posting date here. Next, we need to record the details of the funds, which is basically how the funds were received. And you can see that there's a drop-down menu here with the most common options. If you don't see an appropriate option on the list, you can select Other from the drop-down menu and just manually enter the appropriate method of receipt. For example, virtual currency. Then it's just a matter of entering the amount and the currency that was received. You might notice that FINTRAC hasn't added any virtual currency to this drop-down list yet, so if the transaction was initiated by receipt of a virtual currency, your best bet is to enter the amount in Canadian dollars. Next, we move on to the additional information section, and fields 8 and 9 are one of the most common areas where I see clients get tripped up, because they leave them blank, not realizing that the initiation of the transaction does involve another institution and another person or entity. The most common scenarios where this would need to be completed are when a transaction is initiated by a receipt of a check or incoming EFT. So let's take a look at what this looks like if we receive a check from John Smith from an account held at the Bank of Montreal. First, we need to provide the name of the payor of the check. We also need to provide the institution number and the name of the institution where the account that the funds are being drawn from is held. If you don't know what the number is for a particular institution, you can find the number pretty easily with a quick internet search. Now there's a limit to the number of characters that can be entered in this field, so if you don't have enough space to provide information about the check payor and the institution, just put the name of the check payor. And here in field 9, we need to enter the account from which the funds were drawn. So that example was for a receipt of a check, but for an incoming EFT it would be identical, except we would replace the check payor with the name of the individual or entity that initiated the EFT. Lastly, we need to record how the transaction was conducted, and we have a number of choices on this drop-down menu. If the appropriate method isn't listed here, just select Other and manually enter the appropriate response. And that's part B1. Obviously, if your report is referencing multiple transactions, a separate B1 needs to be completed for each transaction. So let's get started with part B2. So this is part B2 of the STR form. And this is where we document how the transaction was dispositioned, or completed, or proposed to be completed. And this is a really important point to make, because even if we're reporting an attempted transaction and there was no disposition, we still need to report how the client proposed that the transaction would be dispositioned. Alright, so the first field that we need to complete describes on whose behalf this transaction was conducted. And as you'll see in a second, Depending on our response, we may need to complete either Part E or Part F. So as you can see here, we have 4 options. First, we have not applicable, which means that the transaction was conducted by an individual on their own behalf. Next, we have on behalf of an entity, and this refers to an individual who is a representative of an entity conducting a transaction on behalf of that entity. Notice how when I select this option, Part E is now included here in the list of applicable parts. Part E is where we provide FINTRAC with information about the entity on whose behalf the transaction was conducted. I'll show you how to complete that part shortly. Okay, next we have on behalf of another individual. What we're referring to here are third-party transactions. In other words, the person that you're dealing with is acting on the instructions of another individual. A common example of this is an accountant or a lawyer that conducts transactions based on instructions that they receive from their client. Just like when we selected on behalf of an entity, we can see down here on the right side that a new reporting section on behalf of an individual needs to be completed, and we'll get to that section in a little bit. Lastly, we have cash deposit to employer business account. Although technically this would also be considered a transaction that is being conducted on behalf of an entity, FINTRAC provides an exception for this particular circumstance, and we're not required to complete Part E of the report. Next, we need to record how the funds were dispositioned. And you can see here that we have a list of common methods of dispositioning a transaction. As always, if none of these options apply to the transaction that you're reporting, just select Other and manually enter the appropriate method of disposition. The amount and currency of disposition is pretty self-explanatory, I think. And that brings us to fields 15 and 16, where we document other institutions, accounts, and parties that might have been involved in the transaction. This is really similar to fields B8 and 9 that we documented in Part B1. And just like we did in that section, in Part B2 we need to include the name of the other individual or entity, the institution number, and the account number if there was one. Let's see what that might look like if our transaction was completed by sending a wire to an account held by ABC Corporation Limited at the Bank of America. Now you can see here that we're at the character limit of this field, and there isn't enough room to completely enter the institution name. In this case, we should just provide as much information as we can so we can remove the institution name and just provide the name of the receiving entity and the institution number. If there's not enough room to include the institution number, just include the name of the other individual or entity. And lastly, if the funds were dispositioned to another account, include the account number here in field 16. One last thing to mention about Part B2 is that sometimes one transaction can have multiple dispositions. For example, a client could come in with cash and deposit a portion to an account and use the remainder to purchase a bank draft. So it's important to remember that we need to complete a separate Part B2 for each disposition. Alright, let's move on to Part C. Part C is where we document the information about each account that was affected by a disposition. If there is more than one disposition for a transaction, you need to complete Part C for each disposition. Unless the disposition didn't involve an account, in that case you can just leave Part C blank. Okay, the first field that we need to complete here is the branch or transit number. If the account is held at a financial entity, enter the 5-digit transit code for the branch where the account was held. If it's not held at a financial entity, just enter another appropriate identifying number for the branch. In the next fields, we need to include the account number, the account type, and the account currency, which I think is pretty straightforward. In field 5, we need to enter the complete name of the account holders. If the transaction was dispositioned to a joint account, we need to include the names of each account holder. Also, important to remember is that if we're recording the details for a business account, the account holder is the business, rather than the individuals that are authorized to give instructions for the account. Alright, next we need to record the date that the account was opened. And if the account has been closed, we need to include the closing date as well. Lastly, we need to record the status of the account when the transaction was initiated. And here we can select either active, inactive, or dormant. Alright, pretty straightforward. Let's check out Part D. Alright, now we're going to provide FINTRAC with information about the individual that conducted or attempted to conduct the transaction. Remember, we need to complete this section for each transaction that we're reporting as part of the STR, even if the information is identical for each transaction. Now you notice that most of these fields are reasonable measures fields. And the reason for that is that we're required to take reasonable measures to verify the identity of an individual when they conduct a suspicious transaction. Unless, and this is an important point, unless we think that verifying their identity will likely tip them off to the fact that we're going to file an STR. So if for whatever reason you're not able to obtain or verify the identity of the individual, you might not have some of the information that FINTRAC is asking for in Part D, in which case you can just leave those fields blank. Of course, if you do have it, you need to document it in this section. Okay, the first thing that FINTRAC is asking for is the client name. Pretty straightforward, I think no explanation is necessary. Next, FINTRAC is asking for the entity client number. Now, some reporting entities assign a unique client number to each one of their clients. And if your business does this, and a client number has been assigned to the individual that conducted the transaction, you need to include that client number here. Otherwise, you can just leave it blank. Next, we need to provide the complete address of the individual. And remember, when we document an address in a FINTRAC report, we need to provide the residential address where the individual is physically located. So PO boxes or other similar services are definitely not acceptable. Next, we need to record the individual's country of residence, citizenship, and their telephone number. Again, this is pretty straightforward. So now we need to provide some information about the information that was used to verify the individual's identity. You can see here that if you verify the identity using the government photo ID method, then you can just enter the information that would normally be included in your records, in terms of the type of document, the unique ID number, and the jurisdiction where the document was issued. But what about if you verified the individual's identity using the credit file or dual process method? Alright, let's look at how that works for the credit file method. So in field 12, you can see that the credit file is not an option. So just select Other and type credit file. Then, in field 13, you can enter the unique number of the credit file that you reviewed. The fields relating to jurisdiction of issue don't really apply in this case, so you can just leave them blank. Providing details about the dual process method is really similar. In this case, we only need to provide information about one of the documents that were used to verify the identity. So again, just select Other in field 12, and then enter the type of document that was used. For example, bank statement. In field 13, add the account number or unique reference number that was associated with the document. And again, the jurisdiction of issue can be left blank in this case. And in the rest of this section, FINTRAC is asking for additional information such as date of birth, occupation, business number, and information about the individual's employer. There's not a lot of room for confusion here, but always remember that when you're documenting occupation, you need to be as descriptive as possible. Occupations like worker or salesperson are likely to result in deficiencies. You might be okay with occupations like doctor or engineer, but to be on the safe side, you should always provide more detail. For example, cardiologist or mechanical engineer. Alright, let's move on to the next section. If you remember back in part B2 of the report, we needed to tell FINTRAC if the transaction was dispositioned on behalf of another individual or entity. Well, for each transaction that is dispositioned or attempted to be dispositioned on behalf of another entity, we need to complete Part E. And this is the part where we provide FINTRAC with information about that entity. As you can see, the information is pretty basic, and there's not a lot of room for confusion. Still, there are a couple of areas where we need to be careful. First of all, Field 2 here refers to the nature of the business of the entity. So, what kind of products or services do they offer? For example, accounting firm or equipment manufacturer. FINTRAC has a maximum character limit for this field though, so you can't really go into too much detail. Next, when we record the address in these next fields, we need to include the physical address where the entity is located, as opposed to the address of the incorporation. If the entity is incorporated, we need to complete fields 9, 10, and 11. Otherwise, these can be left blank. Lastly, we need to document the full names of the individuals that are authorized to act with respect to the account. If you're an MSB and you're completing this section about an entity that is operating under an ongoing service agreement, you can complete the section using the names of the individuals that sign the agreement on behalf of the entity. Alright, let's move on to Part F. In the last section, we talked about how we need to complete Part E for each transaction that is dispositioned or attempted to be dispositioned on behalf of another entity. Similarly, we need to complete Part F for transactions that are dispositioned or attempted on behalf of another individual in order to provide FINTRAC with the details about that individual. Now this section has an almost identical format as Part D. So if you need detailed instructions on the information that needs to be entered into each field, go back and rewatch that section. Just as an overview though, when we record the individual's address, we need to record their residential address. If we use the credit file or dual process method to verify the individual's identity, we need to select Other in field F12, and then manually enter the type of document that was used, and put the account, reference, or credit file number in field 13. And when we document the individual's occupation, we need to be as detailed as possible, so anyone reading the report will understand what the individual does for a living. One field that is different from Part D is field 25. Here we need to provide the relationship between the individual that conducted the transaction and the individual on whose behalf the transaction was conducted. As you can see, we have a drop-down list, and as always, if you don't see an appropriate option, you can always select Other and manually describe the relationship. So let's move on to Part G, where we're going to describe the reason for our suspicion. Part G is the section of the STR where we describe the reason why we determine that we have reasonable grounds to suspect that the transaction is related to a money laundering or terrorist financing offense. In other words, why are we submitting the STR? And remember, the purpose of the STR is to provide FINTRAC with valuable financial intelligence. So we need to carefully construct a narrative that describes our journey from detecting something unusual to reaching reasonable grounds to suspect. A proper narrative needs to include both facts and context. The relevant facts, of course, depends on the nature of the transaction, but some examples could include the location, date and amount of the transaction, the types of monetary instruments that were used, affected account numbers, the client's occupation, or the relationship between the parties to the transaction. Really anything that would be useful as part of an investigation. Incidentally, if the transactions involved an ATM, this is the part of the report where you would include the location of the machine. It's important to remember that our narrative needs to include the relevant facts for each of the transactions that are referenced in the earlier parts of our STR. The only reason why there should be reference to another transaction is if that transaction was already reported as part of an earlier STR. In that case, make sure to include the FINTRAC report number and the date that the report was submitted. Alright, in addition to facts, our narrative also needs to include context. And when we discuss context, we're talking about factors that provide greater detail to the circumstances in which the transactions occurred, or with respect to the lens through which we viewed the facts. Examples of context include typical transactional behavior for a similar client, or the client's behavior at the time of the transaction. Basically, even if the facts are nearly identical for two transactions, based on the context, we might not come to the same conclusion with respect to whether the transaction is suspicious. For example, consider this. Two individuals come to our branch twice in the same day and make a cash deposit of $4,500. One is a student who makes the deposits to his personal account, and the other is an owner of several convenience stores who makes the deposit to his business account. Well, obviously, even though the facts of the transactions are similar, based on the expected behavior of these clients, that is, based on the context, we would be much more likely to consider the deposits by the student to be suspicious. Alright, so once we've established our facts and context, we need to put them together to describe the suspicious indicator or indicators. In other words, what is it about the facts, when viewed in conjunction with the context, that led us to suspect that the transaction might be related to money laundering or terrorist financing activity? If we suspect that the transactions are related to a specific predicate offense, for example, drug trafficking or tax evasion, we should note that in our narrative as well. Alright, great. In addition to our description of facts, context, and indicators, it's also very important to describe the steps that we took to review the transaction and the information that we obtained from the review. The reason for this is that we're required to submit STRs to FINTRAC as soon as is practicable. So it's important that we demonstrate that once we identify that a transaction was unusual, that we kept our investigation moving forward, and that once we determined that we had reasonable grounds to suspect, we submitted our STR within a reasonable time frame. When we describe our review process, there's a few things that we need to include. Firstly, we need to include how and when the transaction came to our attention. Was it through interaction with the teller, through transaction monitoring, or maybe some other way? Next, we need to describe the steps that we took to review the activity and when we took them. Examples of review activities could be contacting the client for more information, reviewing the client's transaction history, or conducting searches on the internet for more information about the client. If through our review we discover any additional information that contributed to us reaching the threshold for reasonable grounds to suspect, we need to include that in our narrative as well. Lastly, we need to include the date that we determined that there were reasonable grounds to suspect a money laundering or terrorist financing offense. Okay, there's just a couple of things that I want to mention before we look at an example. The first thing is, if you have any other information that you feel might be useful as part of an investigation, things like license plate numbers, known aliases, or email or IP addresses, be sure to include those in your narrative as well. Lastly, always remember that the person reviewing the STR will not be someone who is from your company, and they may not even be familiar with your industry. So always make sure to avoid acronyms, abbreviations, or terms that wouldn't be familiar to the average person. Alright, let's see what a narrative looks like for the following scenario. A US citizen came into our credit union to open an account. At that time, he told us he was unemployed. A couple of months later, though, during scheduled transaction monitoring, we noticed that, for the past 6 weeks, he'd been making regular cash deposits of $3,300 at 2-week intervals. This seemed unusual for an unemployed person, so we reached out to the client to get a better idea of where the funds were coming from. And he told us that the cash was a gift from his girlfriend. Well, it seemed pretty unlikely to us that his girlfriend was giving him a gift of $3,300 in cash every 2 weeks. But before we could follow up to get more information, he closed his account and wired his entire balance to an account held in the US. At this point, we determined that we had reasonable grounds to suspect that the individual was working in Canada without the proper documentation and was being paid in cash to prevent detection. Alright, let's take a look at the narrative for that scenario. So first of all, here's a pro tip. If you suspect that the transactions were related to a particular predicate offense, start your narrative off with a headline that includes that information. As you can see here, we start off with our headline, Suspected Individual Working Illegally in Canada. This gives the analyst at FINTRAC that's reviewing the STR an idea of what to expect from your narrative. Alright, so we're starting off with some background facts here. On May 4th, David J. Kay, member number 25970, a US citizen, opened a personal Canadian dollar checking account, account number 246-00015, at our Main Street branch. At the time that his account was opened, Mr. Kay informed us that he was unemployed. Notice that we're providing a lot of details here, like the account and member numbers. Next, we're telling FINTRAC when and how we were alerted to the transactions, as well as providing some relevant facts about those transactions. However, on June 8, 2020, while conducting scheduled transaction monitoring, we discovered that Mr. Kay had made 3 cash deposits of $3,300 at our Main Street branch at 2-week intervals on Friday, May 8th, Friday, May 22nd, and Friday, June 5th. These cash deposits were inconsistent with Mr. Kay's stated employment status. In this last sentence, we've both provided the context, which is the type of transactions that would be expected from an unemployed person, as well as our indicator that the transactions might be suspicious, which is that the transactions described above are not consistent with those expected transaction patterns. Moving on, we're describing how and when we reviewed the suspicious transaction and the results of the review. On Monday, June 8th, Mr. Kay was contacted by telephone to obtain a better understanding of the source of the funds. Mr. Kay informed us that the cash was a gift from his girlfriend. This seemed doubtful based on the large volume of cash and the regularity with which the deposits were made. Our suspicious scenario had one more transaction, and so next we're providing the facts related to that transaction, remembering to provide as much detail as possible. And we also let FINTRAC know when we reach the threshold for reasonable grounds to suspect. However, on June 10th, before we could obtain more information, Mr. Kay closed his account and wired his entire balance to his Citibank account, account number 256-20042, held at a branch in Yonkers, New York, routing number 21-00089. On the same day, we determined that we had reasonable grounds to suspect that Mr. Kay was working in Canada without a work visa and was being paid under the table. And finally, because one of our tellers saw Mr. Kay drive away from the branch, we're providing FINTRAC and law enforcement with some bonus information. On the day that Mr. Kay closed his account, he was seen leaving the branch in a silver, late model Acura sedan with a license plate starting in AKZ. Alright, so that's how to document the narrative of your suspicion. In summary, our narrative needs to include facts, context, a description of why the combination of facts and context is suspicious, when and how you became aware of the suspicious activity, how and when you reviewed the transactions and the information that we obtained from that review, and when you achieved reasonable grounds to suspect. Okay, let's move on to part H. So this is the portion of the STR form where we provide FINTRAC with information about any additional actions that were taken in addition to reporting the transactions to FINTRAC. The most common actions that I typically see reporting entities take are closing the client's account or otherwise prohibiting them from conducting further transactions, adjusting the client's risk rating, or designating the client for enhanced monitoring. These things are all reasonable actions to take, and if you do take a similar action, you should report it to FINTRAC in this section. What's really useful to FINTRAC, though, is providing information about any communication that you had with law enforcement or another authority, such as the CRA, about the client and the transactions. As with Part G, we need to provide as much detail as possible in terms of the actions that were taken and when those actions were taken. If there was communication with law enforcement or another authority, we need to provide the contact info for the person that we spoke with. Here's an example of what a Part H entry might look like. On July 5th, we closed the client's account number 255600013, and added the client's name to our internal blacklist. On July 6th, 2020, we reported the suspicious transactions to Frederick Thompson of the Canada Revenue Agency, and there's the phone number and the extension number, at the Ottawa office. And we've also given the address of that office where that individual can be located. Keep in mind that aside from filing an STR, we're not required by the regulation to take any further measures. So if you didn't conduct any additional actions, you can just leave this section blank. Okay, so that's how you complete a suspicious transaction report. And after watching this video, you should have a much clearer understanding of how to complete each report section. Just follow the steps that we discussed, and you can avoid deficiencies relating to proper STR completion during your FINTRAC examinations or effectiveness reviews. If you have any other questions relating to suspicious transaction reporting or other anti-money laundering issues, visit us at www.theamlshop.ca or email me directly at adam@theamlshop.ca. Thanks for watching.